75% of the market based on the data we learned from our national accounts, okay? And within that product category, we know that these items have the largest item weight, meaning that this company called Freight Movers Worldwide had the largest amount of sales in the initial collection period. So let's say they had their prices changed a lot in this last period. Okay, this item, actually you can see that's what I've done here. If this item, this highly weighted item within the highly weighted category, if the price did not change in my most recent period, if the price stayed 1,058 in both periods, you'll see that my indexes, oops, it's hard-coded. You could see my indexes are more alike. So now, because that item did not have a significant change, my index here is 104.82. Oh, it's not hard-coded. Now I have to find that item. It was Freight Movers Worldwide. It was this one, Manchester to Dublin. If I change it to 1058, my indexes are not going to be quite as different if my large, most weighted items and my most heavily weighted categories do not have significant changes. Then the weights don't make as much of a difference. Okay, but with your larger companies in your larger product categories do move differently than your other prices, adding item weights and adding detailed product categories within your ISIC 4 digits will improve the accuracy of your indexes. That's what I wanted to show you with this exercise here. And also, as I said, this can also be helpful for seeing the different ways you can calculate indexes using these different approaches. Whether it has item weights, whether it doesn't have item weights, whether it has product categories, and whether it does not. Okay, now, because, and I apologize here, I want to change that calculation file so that it's done the same way on the slides and on the spreadsheet. So I'm going to change that when we finish here today, and I'm going to resend you that file. And then I've sent all these files to Mr. Seppi. He should have them all in his email, so we'll get them posted at some point. But like I said, I'm going to just change them a little bit to make it a little more consistent. I really apologize. It's because I was pulling from a couple different sources, but hopefully the concepts are clear. The concepts are, if we don't have item weights, we take geo means of the price relatives, and we compare them from one period to the next to calculate our elementary aggregate. If we have item weights, then we're going to take our price relatives multiplied by those reference period item weights, and now our price relatives are weighted based on the size of the company. Okay, so that your largest airline in Indonesia will have more impact on your index than a smaller airline. Now, if you have maybe the same situation that existed in Ireland, where international freight shipping, maybe the prices change a little differently there because they're affected by international market forces. Maybe exchange rates come into the picture there and affect prices. If you identify detailed categories that you think might experience different price changes, you will improve your accuracy by creating detailed price indexes for those categories. And basically what will happen there is that if we did not create those product categories, we assumed that companies that did not report, that they moved similarly to both the domestic and the international together. But by creating more detailed product subcategories, you're also improving the accuracy of your missing price estimation, whether you omit the prices or whether you impute them. The more detailed your list of items that are together in the elementary aggregate, the more accurate your indexes could become. So now, that doesn't mean you should always make more and more detailed indexes, because you could just keep doing that forever. You could do, freight transportation only for companies that are in a certain district within Jakarta. I mean, yeah, you can go too far with it, right? So it's a balance. But if you can evaluate detailed product categories that you can come up with an economic reason that you expect prices to move differently, then your accuracy will benefit by creating different detailed price indexes there. And really, it's the combination of the item weights, where your more important companies have more impact, and the detailed product weights, where you're controlling how much of your aggregate index comes from different types of transactions. The combination of that, and again, this is my personal experience based on doing a lot of SPPIs. I found that when we made those kinds of changes, by thinking hard about what would be the most logical, detailed product categories, and by trying our best to collect item weights or estimating item weights if companies did not report sales, that for us anyway, it did help us. So, I think those might be things for you to think about as you continue on in your development. And maybe there's some areas where it doesn't matter quite as much. If most of your companies are basically the same size within a particular activity, maybe that would be the case for hotels. Maybe that you don't really have any one hotel that dominates Indonesia, right? So maybe the item weights are less important for an activity like that. But for airlines, you'd think, wow, those item weights could really make a big impact if we get the large companies reporting. And similar with telecommunications, once we get the large companies reporting. So I'm going to pause there. I see I did get some good questions, and maybe we could also open it up for any additional questions. First question I see here is, can you determine the base year instead of the beginning of the year? So I think the point there is maybe using an annual average as the period that equals 100. Actually, I'm not sure. I apologize. I'm not sure I understand that question about the base year versus the beginning of the year, but please, if you want to write a clarification, I'd be happy to try to answer that one. Like I said, this Excel spreadsheet has been sent to today. So absolutely, every single file that I go through, I want to make sure you have, and I want to make sure that you're going to get the file with the formulas in the spreadsheet so you can follow along. For me personally, that's how I learned. I needed to see, I've been talking quite a bit this morning. Hopefully that helps a little. But I know there's some people who are just going to want to look at the spreadsheet and see what I'm multiplying by what. For me personally, that's how I learned as well. So absolutely, all of these spreadsheets will be available. If for some reason you are not getting access to them, I'll make sure everybody has my email. Hopefully everyone does, but I'll send it to everyone as well.
Yes, we already get the file.
Okay, very good. And like I said, I'm going to send an alternative file as well that does the same calculations in a different way. And also I'll make it so that we don't hard code that last tab so that you can see how it changes as we change prices. But yes, I absolutely will give you access to all of this. How long do we use the 25 and 75%? So that's another really good question. So I mentioned when we talked about weights, there are 3 different types of weights involved in calculating a PPI. The first one is what we call the index weights. That's how much total revenue was produced by all producers in freight transportation. Those numbers you update whenever the national accounts updates their weights. So basically, every 10 years you're doing that, okay? So those index weights are updated periodically. In your case, every 10 years. You know, in other countries might do it every 5 years. I think the more frequently you can update, it's an advantage, but you know, that's when you update those weights. The next kind of weight was called product weights. And what the product weights are is detailed index aggregations below the ISIC 4-digit level. So that 7525, which was referring to international freight transport by road versus national freight transport by road, were product weights, okay, because they're more detailed than the ISIC 4-digit, but they also come from the same source as your index weights. They're also going to come from national accounts, or they're going to come from the economic census. So just like the index weights, those stay fixed for the same period. So if you update your index weights every 10 years with the new national accounts or with the new economic census, that's the same time you would update your product category weights, the 75 and 25. You want to keep those aligned, okay? The item weights come from when you collect certain activities and collect the company's sales. I've mentioned that those can be different between different activities. So the company sales for your freight transportation companies could be coming from a different time period than the company sales for your mining companies, because the item weights are only used within categories. They do not get used across categories. I hope that helps with that question. Okay. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to take them, or maybe we can move on to quality adjustment.
Maybe we can move on to a quality adjustment.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll start sharing my slides again. Okay, oops. Copied in the wrong thing there. So quality adjustment. Why does quality adjustment matter? So quality adjustment is something we use to separate pure price change from volume change. If the quality of a good or service improves, it provides more utility to the purchasers of the product. As a result, those are considered changes in the volume of output produced. If we don't make adjustments for quality in our price indexes, we will instead show those changes as price changes, right? If you have a wireless plan that now has greater data capacity, it's a higher quality product. If we do not make an adjustment and instead show any price changes associated with that quality improvement, then it will not be shown in the deflated real output, which is where we want to show it there. So basically the rule to remember here is if your price remains unchanged, but quality improves, that should be shown as a real price decrease. And if we ignore it, then our volume indicators will not be accurate. Okay, we want real prices to decrease so that volumes would increase. And on the opposite side of that, if the price remains unchanged, but the quality deteriorates, this should ideally be shown as a real price increase. So when do we do quality adjustment? We do quality adjustment when something about the product we're tracking changes. Okay, we don't do it when there's a big price increase just because we think it's a big price increase and we're getting nervous and we don't want to put it in the index. That is not an appropriate time to do quality change. We do quality adjustment only when the nature of the good or service we are pricing changes. Okay, so one of the options we could do is the comparable replacement method. The comparable replacement method means that we know that the quality of the product has changed. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. Remember, I said we do quality adjustment whenever the product changes in some fundamental way. Okay. Now, if a product changes, but it happens to be no improvement in quality, you know, this can happen sometimes. You know, sometimes with certain goods, maybe they just like rename a product to try to like improve the marketing of it. So that would be a change in the product, right? The name changed. But if it's exactly the same quality, we don't have to make any adjustment. So that would be the comparable replacement, meaning something about the product has changed, but the quality remains the same. And again, this rarely occurs in practice. So you don't want to just assume that, yes, the product changed, but I'm assuming it's about the same quality. That's not the best method. Another method is called explicit quality adjustment. And this is used when you are able to quantify the difference in quality between the old and new products. This method is ideal, but difficult to execute in practice. There are some kinds of quality adjustments. Explicit quality adjustments are listed here. The first one is the quantity adjustment, production cost approach, and hedonic modeling. So these examples here are taken from the Eurostat OECD methodological guide for developing producer price indices for services. This is an excellent source of information. I'm going to show you where you can access it online, but this methodological guidebook provides a lot of information beyond what I've covered in this workshop this week. And so I highly recommend it as a source that you can refer back to. So here we have an example of a quantity adjustment for a service. Here we have a cleaning service. In period 1, a weekly cleaning service is provided for a customer with office space of 1,000 square meters with a total price of 20,000 pounds here, British pounds. In period 2, the customer has rented additional office space of 200 square meters, and the service provider now charges a total of 25,200 pounds. So here, the quality of the service has changed because now the company is cleaning 1,200 square meters as opposed to 1,000 that they cleaned before. Okay, and they've adjusted their prices to account for this difference. Here we could just look at the difference in the quantity of space that's being cleaned. And The new price represents a per square meter charge of 21 euros. Excuse me, I've been saying British pounds, but I believe that's actually the sign for euros. So here the price increases now from 21 to 20. So we can apply this adjustment to the price relative in the period where this quantity change has taken place. And so that now, instead of comparing 25,200 to 20,000, in this period, we will account for the fact that the number of square meters that has been cleaned is changed. And we will instead use a short-term relative of 1.05, representing only the difference in the per square meter price in that month. Here's an example where we have a difference in production and option costs. In period 1, a certain service is provided for the price of 1,000 euros. In period 2, the price increases to 1,100 euros. However, some quality aspect of the service changes as well. Okay, so remember, here, let's say we're talking about a freight transportation service. Maybe now the company used to be able to guarantee that they could get their goods from the origin to the destination in 2 days. And now, because of some improvement, maybe there's a new highway, or they're able to be more efficient with how they group their shipments, and now they can provide it quicker. That would be an example of a quality improvement that we could estimate based on the production costs needed to produce that improvement. So in this example, the cost associated with making the quality change was 130 euros. Okay, so we can use that 130 euros to adjust out from the new higher price. And here now we find that factoring in the cost of making the quality improvement, we actually had a price decrease of 3%, rather than the price increasing from 1,000 euros to 1,100 euros. I could tell you there were some real examples where we would use this method. Yeah, of course, it's very difficult to get the information about how much costs have increased. It's not easy. But for example, in the United States, when we would price software services, like let's say a company went from version 1 of a piece of software to version 2. And version 2 had introduced a lot of quality improvements to the software. We would ask the companies if they can estimate the per unit cost of developing all those software improvements, and then we would apply that to adjust it out of any price changes between version 1 and version 2. Now, again, in most cases, companies would not be able to provide that information, but surprisingly enough, in some cases, they were able to provide it. So, we always thought of the production cost method as the ideal method, but very difficult to execute in practice. So in all honesty, this would be rarely used, but whenever we could, we would use it. Now, some countries use hedonic modeling to estimate the value of quality changes. Truthfully, I think this is used a lot less than you might think from reading academic papers. I know there were some cases where we used this in the United States, but in truth, I don't think it made substantial differences in many of the price indexes. Where it did make a substantial effect was in things like computer hardware. But let me just try to quickly explain, without going into details, the concept of what a hedonic quality adjustment method is. Basically, what this is you take some data source that has the prices of many different products and lists each of the characteristics that those different products have down to a very granular level. So let me see if I have an example. Oh, no, I don't. Okay, so an example would be for hardware, computer hardware. Maybe you have a list of all the computers in the market, and you list out the prices for those computers and what is the exact amount of memory that each model has, and what exactly is the size of the hard drive for each of the different computer models on the market. In some cases, we were able to get these data sources, and then you run a regression to see how much of the price variation between these different products is caused by the variation of these product features. Again, I think this is something that's nice to do as an advanced application, but it is not a normal part of PPI calculation. Now to something that was a very common method, I think that we use for quality adjustment. It's called the overlap method. If you're unable to use the methods we discussed earlier to explicitly quantify the value of the quality change, your next best option is to apply an overlap. Okay, and this is by far the most common quality adjustment method that I've seen used in price indexes around the world. And it's a good method. It's a method, when we use the overlap method, we are not ignoring quality change, we're trying to do something about it. So we want to use this when possible. So let's say we have an elementary aggregate with 3 items, item A, B, and C. Okay. In February, actually, let me take that back. In March, item C stops being produced. Now, maybe that's a very clear case of a product being taken off the market. Like if we're talking about a telecommunications company, maybe they had a particular wireless plan, and then they reorganized the structure of their plans, and the old plan is no longer offered. That would be one example where we have a replacement product. But it does not need to be that straightforward. It could also be like I described earlier, where you have a particular software and it goes from version 1 to version 2. So it's not like the product completely exits the market. It's just that something about the product has improved or gotten worse, either one. So if you have a company selling freight transportation between a particular origin and a destination, and they go from using one type of plane that takes a day to make the trip to now using a different type of plane where they could make the trip in a half a day, we would consider that now a replacement product. Okay, they're still shipping goods between origin A and destination B. It's just now that they're able to do it better. That also counts as a replacement product. Anytime the quality of the product changes, we now have a replacement product. Okay, so in this example, in March, maybe this company that produces item C says, now this product has improved. If the product improves, now we would call that product D. Okay. Anything that changes the quality of the product really makes it a new product. So the ideal method we'd want to use is in the month where we have to substitute in the new replacement product, we want to see if we can get a previous period price for that product as well. So in this example, in March, we would remove item C, right? It's no longer offered. I no longer have a price for that product. And now item D comes in. The ideal case would be that item D was also produced in February. Okay, so sometimes maybe in the example of the software company, they go from version 1 to version 2, but maybe when version 2 first comes out, they're still selling version 1, creating an overlap period. So we wait until the new product has been in the market for 2 months, and now we could use February as our overlap period, because in February, both the old product and the new product both were being sold. So here's an example of how that would work with price relatives. So in period 2, which was February, we had price relatives for item A, B, and C, right? Because all the items were produced in January and February. It's when we get to March that, oh, excuse me, this is changed a little bit here. So now what happens is item D goes away in the 3rd month. So in its place, we get replacement item D, which comes in period 3. Here, because you don't have an overlap period where the old item D and the new item D are both sold, we can't create an overlap period. So this is not an ideal example here. Ideally, what we would want is that we would have a price for the replacement item D in period 2. Because if we had, let's say the replacement item D was also sold for 85 in period 2, then we could overlap the new product in period 3, and we would have a price relative for the item in every single month. If the replacement item D had no price change in period 3, if it was also sold at 85 in period 2, our price relative would be 1 for replacement item D, and we could use it in our price calculation for period 3. Now, in this example, because there is no period where both items are produced, we instead have to wait to period 4 to bring the item in. So, okay, so here actually, now we say for an overlap method, what would happen is, again, for us to do the overlap, we want to have the replacement item produced in the market the same time as the old item was produced. In this example now, the replacement item D was sold for $80 in period 2. So in period 3, when we have the new item, again, we don't want to compare the new price of the replacement item, 85, to the price of the old item, 120. That would be the direct comparison method. And you could only do that if the quality of the product is exactly the same. And again, that very rarely happens. If you have a new product that is substituted into the market, by default, I would assume that it's different. I would only do comparable comparison, basically comparing the 120 directly to the 85. Only if I had explicit information from the company that says, yes, this product is exactly the same quality. If I have no information, I would assume they are different quality, and I would use this overlap method, and I would use a price relative of 1.06 in period 3, as opposed to a price relative of 85 divided by 120, which would be as if we directly compared. Now, sometimes what compilers will do is they'll say, oh no, look, I have a new product. I can't compare it to the old one. I can't compare 85 to 120. So I'll just say there was no change in period 3. I'll just say, all right, look, my price relative is 1. I'm going to start from 85 and I'll go forward from there. That is not the best method because that creates a bias in the index by saying every time a new product is introduced, there is no price change. Most times, well, I won't say most times, but in a lot of instances, companies use product updates as an opportunity to change the prices of their products as well. So here, by overlapping the replacement product, we're able to use a price relative of 1.06 in the first month the item is added to the index, rather than a price relative of 1. Okay. Now, if you are unable to explicitly quantify the quality change, like I said, and I think that will be the case in almost all cases, and you're also unable to identify an overlap period, the next best option is mean imputation. And I know this is another advantage of using mean imputation. With the mean imputation method, you can link the price of the new item to the imputed price of the old item in the same period. So again, if you choose to omit missing products from your index calculation rather than impute prices for them, another disadvantage is that you cannot use this imputation method to bring in a replacement item. Let me show you how this would work. So here we have a case where actually, this is not a good example because this shows an overlap period. So let me go back here. This is, remember the first example I showed you, we did not have an overlap period. Item D was produced in period 2. And then in period 3, item D is off the market and replacement item D comes into the market. So here we don't have a price for replacement item D in period 2. So I cannot use the overlap method to introduce replacement item D with a real price relative showing changes from period 2 to period 3. Okay, so the mean imputation method is used when there is no overlap period. So what I do here is I could take the geometric mean of the items that had prices in both period 3 and period 2. That would be item A, item B, and item C. When I take the geometric mean here, because I don't have item weights. Now, if I had item weights, I would calculate the index the way we saw in that spreadsheet with the weighted relatives. But here I don't have item weights, so I'm going to just use my geometric mean. And my geometric mean of the price relatives for item A, B, and C is 1.02. Okay, so now I impute a price for the old item in period 3. And the imputed price will be the old price multiplied by 1.02. I get 122.39. Now I will take a price relative of 1.02. Okay. I actually think a clearer way to do this would have been to take a price in period 2 that was 85 divided by 1.02, because you'd have the same impacts, but now you'd move to the new item. So now I'm introducing this item in its first period with a price relative not of 1, like we normally would start a new item with. I'm introducing it with 1.02. Then in period 3, where actually, excuse me, now in period 4, I have a price relative working from this increased level. So basically what this does, I apologize again for being a little unclear, but here we have a period where a new item comes into the market and we do not have an overlap period. So in this period, what we're going to do with this method is we're going to estimate that its price has changed based on the average of all the other items that existed in the index. And that is the exact same method we use when an item goes missing, when a factory closes. Okay. When I showed you before the method we use when the factory closes, we don't assume no change for the factory. We assume that its prices are moving at the same rate as the other items in the aggregate. So here, by using this mean imputation method, we again are going to assume that the price for item D, which we can observe, right? Because we don't have either item D or replacement item D produced in both period 3 and period 2. So I can't directly observe a price relative for that item in period 3. So what I do instead is I assume the price relative changed based on the average of the other items. If you instead say, look, I have no information about item D, it's a new item, so I'm just going to bring it in with a price relative of 1.0, you would be putting a downward bias on your index. Okay, I want to kind of reiterate that point. It's a little tricky, but it's very important. So often when you bring in a new item to your index, you're not going to have an overlap period, and you're not going to know anything about the quality differences between item D and replacement item D. In this case, your best bet is to use some form of this mean imputation method so that in the month of substitution between item D and replacement item D, you actually have a price relative based on the other items within the cell. Okay. So to summarize, explicit methods of quality adjustment, like the quantity method we looked at, like the production cost method we looked at, they're the best if you could do them. However, in my experience, it's very difficult to get that information, particularly for services. Okay, so you try to get that information, but in most cases you will not be able to, and so you move on to one of these implicit methods. The best of the implicit methods is the overlap, because the overlap lets you get observed prices, observed price change in the month of the item substitution. And you do that by getting a previous period price for your new item. If either you're not able to get that previous period price for your new item, or there is no previous price because the replacement item was not offered in the market in the same month that the old item was, then the mean imputation is the recommended method. Okay, so I want to pause here, and I know that that is tricky. But the thing, when I worked with staff on PPI, I think they were very often tempted to just bring in new items with a price relative of 1. And we really had to coach them not to do that. Now, if you don't use mean imputation, then you have to find some alternative way of bringing replacement items in, not with a relative of 1. I know that there probably can be ways for you to achieve that outcome, but that might be something for you to think about if you're not already comfortable with it. Like, you want to make sure that you'll be able to not always introduce items with a relative of 1. Okay, I see I do have some questions here, so I'll take those. It is very difficult to get explicit pricing methods. Yes. Can I say that the manual want us to be careful about this situation, not strictly have the data? So yeah, so methodologists will always say, look, you should do some kind of quality adjustment. You should figure out what the cost difference is between the old product and the new product. You should do a hedonic model. And that's correct. Methodologically, you do want to try to do that. I'm just saying in practice, it's very difficult to do. And I can tell you that many countries may say they use these methods, but in practice, they're still not able to get that information most of the time. Okay, so where possible, we would try to figure out a strategy to get that explicit method. Now, again, if you have a quantity situation where, for the cleaning service, where they go from cleaning one space to a different space and it's a different size, then you'll be able to get some explicit quality adjustment in there. But I think for a lot of cases, it's just not that straightforward, and you're not going to be able to get an explicit quality method. But I want to be clear that if you can get explicit information on the quality differences, that is the best method to use. Okay, what if the selected type of explicit quality adjustments are not met? What are the consequences? So again, the explicit methods are basically trying to use observed data to estimate the real price increase between the old quality product and the new quality product. If you're not able to do that, you basically are going to make an assumption. I think the overlap is the next best alternative, because you're able to say, look, I'm not able to explicitly measure the change between the old quality product and the new one, but I can at least show the change of the new product in the first month of substitution. Now, if you have an activity where the quality changes become very substantial and they accumulate over time, telecommunications might be one of these areas. That's where the implication is that your index will not perfectly capture pure price change for those activities that experience a great deal of quality improvement over time. So those are going to be your high-tech services. That's traditionally the areas where we see this. So that's where we put extra effort into trying to estimate the quality differences between the products over time. That's why I mentioned, hedonic modeling for computer hardware. I think you want to spend your time trying to get explicit data for those areas where you know that quality is constantly changing. So the implications, if you're not able to do explicit quality adjustment for computer hardware over a period of 20 years, your index is probably going to stay pretty flat. Whereas based on observed quality differences, your index probably should have declined by about 50%. Let me try to explain that a little bit more clearly. So for example, in the US, we've been pricing computer hardware from the 1980s to today. Prices for computers have been fairly flat in the US over this period. However, the quality of the hardware has increased dramatically. If you can think back to the computers you were using in the 1990s, that I was using in the 1990s, wow, they were really not as good as what we have today. But the prices aren't that different, but the quality is substantially improved. So if you did not do explicit quality adjustment for computer hardware, your index would probably be relatively flat over this period, whereas once you add in explicitly quality adjustment, I believe in the US, the price index for computer hardware is now at about 20. It's declined from about 100 to 20 over time because the quality kept improving and we had to account for that increased quality. Now, for services like freight transportation, I don't think you're going to have a dramatic impact. It's really those high-tech areas where the explicit quality adjustment is extremely important. I hope that helps. So for hedonic modeling, how is it used? Like I said, for things like computer hardware, I believe the US, which is the statistical system I just happen to know about, they purchase data about computers. They purchased, like, there's some private company that lists all the computers on the market and all their features. And the BLS actually goes and buys that publication. And then they're able to build a regression model and test for significance between the prices and all those characteristics between all the computers that are on the market. And based on the results of that model, now they can say when the RAM on the computer changes, they use the model to get a dollar value that quantifies the value of each additional megabyte of RAM. Like I said, it's a highly technical procedure. If you're interested in this method, or if this is something, I don't know if you use this at all in BPS, but if it was something that you were interested in pursuing, again, for high-tech areas, I think hardware would be one. I don't know if it, by the way, we don't even make very much computer hardware in the United States anymore. So it's become less important over time. We just import it all. But if you're interested in additional information, I can get that information to you. I can connect you with someone who could describe it a lot better than I can and can actually walk you through an actual calculated model. But that's what it does. You do a regression model, and ultimately you're able to figure out a dollar value for every additional megabyte of RAM, every additional piece of memory on the computer. And then when you observe those changes in the models you're pricing, you apply the adjustment based on those values. All right. I would say I'm not the best at describing hedonic modeling, but I can explain the concept. All right. Can I give an example of calculation of the overlap method for the price in the previous month, which is lower than the current month? Sure. How is the treatment usually fluctuates? Okay, let me see if I can do that. All right. So let's take I want to do this in the right way. All right. So I'm going to share the spreadsheet from the index calculation, and I'll try to create an overlap with one of the items. And I'll show you one where, what does it say? The price was lower than the current month. Okay. So I'm back now to the spreadsheet I showed you before. Right, so you can see I have this group of items. I'll choose the one that has item weights and product categories here. I could choose any one of them. But let's say this item, dry goods between Manchester and Dublin. Let's say now they're able to you know, I don't know in this example what would be a good case where they're able to provide a higher quality service of shipping dry goods between Manchester and Dublin, but let's just say that they are in some way. So the price before was 1,058, but now they're able to ship these goods in some completely different way, and the price is 1,500 now. Okay, I hope you guys can see this, but I'll try to prove this concept in. All right, so now they have a new product that's 1,500. The old way of shipping goods is not available anymore. Okay, now they have this new way and it costs $1,500. But I'm able to create an overlap period because they said, oh, only for some clients, we were able to use this new way also in the previous month. And then it actually costs $2,000. Not doing right here. Okay, it costs $2,000 the old way in the new period. So now I'm going to introduce this item with a price relative of 0.75, reflecting that overlap between the new price of comparing the current price and the previous price of the new product for this shipment. So what I've done there now is I've created an overlap. I just did it here by changing the previous period price. And you know, that works here. That achieves the outcome in the exact way I want, because now I have a price relative. You know, the only difference is that I would have to create now actually two fields, one for calculating this item in the prior period, and one for creating it in the current period. So let me show you that. All right, so here the price was 50. Actually, I can't remember what the price was. It was something like, let's say it was 1,200. All right. Now this new product comes in. Excuse me, it's just going to take me a little bit to get this going here. Ugh. Well, basically what I would have to do here is I'd have to have one line for this item so I get the price relative that's used in this period of 1,200 divided by 1013, the price of the old quality product. And then I bring in a new product with here a price relative of 0.75. So my price relative I use in this period is 1.1846. Now I move to a new period where the price relative associated with the weight is now 0.75. I'd have to, you know, kind of set it up a little differently, but in effect, that's how it works, right? We have the price relative for the first month we introduced the new product would be 0.75 there because the price declined in the overlap period. I apologize if that was not as clear as it could be, but I hopefully you get the idea. That's all the overlap is doing, is it's showing the price change of the new product in the month that it's introduced. All right. So generally for PPI, especially for manufacturing products like clothes, the closed product is produced one time and they sell it to the market, and the market just sells it with X level price, which never changes. Clothes change only because they discount, or the type of style of clothes change. Absolutely true. Okay, so let me, this is actually the biggest problem we've had when people have tried to use big data. Like if you try to go to online sellers of clothes You know, it's not so much that the same product sells at different prices in different periods. It's just that they keep bringing in new products, and that's how price changes come in. So what I would say, so let me kind of take it back to the services world, which I think will be a little different than the manufacturing. Our solution for that situation in the services world is to create a model price. All right, that's how we deal with the problem. Remember, I said when you have a product that is not produced under similar terms and conditions each period, we're going to have to do some kind of model that estimates price change. If you have products that are not produced in the market consistently, you either have to do a model price or you have to use a different kind of method. I think what we see is that it's more common in CPI for these kinds of trends with clothing, but the strategy that would actually be used is you would employ loose specifications here. So if your very tight specification is a very specific sweater, you know, that the factory makes, but then they only make it once and then they don't sell it again. Now you widen out your specification to say all sweaters, or all sweaters that are made of cotton. And then you can compare prices of different sweaters as long as they're made up of the same material and so on. That's actually how we deal with that problem in most practical cases. We use what's called, we loosen up the specifications. That's what CPI does for apparel. Instead of having very tight specifications, they loosen them up for goods like apparel, where the specific products change very frequently. Okay. Prepared food. They never change the price, but the quantity of the food is actually different. So there you could use a quantity adjustment. Remember, we do quality adjustment not just when the price changes, we do it when the quality of the product changes. So that means that's why we need to put a lot of specifications on our questionnaire. That's why the questionnaire has to say exactly how much food is provided, so that when it changes, the respondent tells us that. They say, you used to get 10 ounces of food, now you get 15 ounces of food. And then we can apply a quantity adjustment using the method I just showed you. You could do that even when the price is the same. Basically, what you would do is saying, let's say the quantity of food provided increases and the price stays the same, you would now show that as a price decline using the quantity adjustment that I showed earlier. During the pandemic, some companies changed their way of providing services. For example, on education using online, there's no change in price. This has been a very controversial issue, this issue of online education. I would say that is a quality difference personally. So I would, you know, and most of the compilers that have been dealing with that issue are CPI compilers. So I kind of want to be careful. Maybe I'll try to see if there's explicit guidance that's been provided on that issue specifically. Again, I want to stress here the concept that you do not need a nominal price change to make a quality adjustment. If you know that the quality of the product has changed in some way, ideally you could explicitly quantify it. I don't know how you'd do that for education. That would be very difficult. But if you could, you can sometimes estimate the quality deterioration. So let's say they're charging the same price, but using some method that you are very transparent about and you explain to your data users, you say, we estimate that the quality has now decreased by 20% based on this known observed phenomenon, like using online education. And if you estimate a 20% decline in quality, you would then put an increase in the prices if the nominal price was unchanged. Okay, decreased quality, prices stay the same. Not in nominal terms, means real prices have increased. Yes, on the hedonic modeling, they do purchase the data. They don't purchase the actual data that goes in the price index, right? The price index comes from direct respondents that they collect themselves. It's only the hedonic model, the data that feeds into the hedonic model that's purchased for whatever that's worth. I think there are other cases where, they could get the data for a hedonic model from if there's a regulatory agency that keeps data on all the products in the market. But yes, I know for computer hardware, the way they actually do it in the US is they purchase the data for the model. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you on this online education. I know this is a very controversial issue all over the world. I think in the US, we've had a situation where, when everything shut down in March, students were in university, and sometimes they sent students home, right at the point of the crisis, and then they continued the courses online. And in the US, they didn't give some of the tuition money back. They didn't say you're getting a lower quality for the period when you get classes from home. And actually, some parents have sued the universities, saying, we should get a refund because we didn't get the same quality of education when the students went online. So I personally find it a very interesting issue. I think, unfortunately, it's probably a controversial issue. If you're going to state that, you estimate the quality of education services decline when they go remote only, that would be something you probably want to talk to senior managers about before you would implement a change like that, because it has some policy implications. And but it's a very interesting theoretical issue, and I think people are discussing it. If I can find any materials where CPI compilers are discussing it, I'll try to forward those along. Again, if restaurants used to have fresh food and now they sell frozen food, I would consider that a quality change. Yes.
Andrew, I think that education using online is a new thing in Indonesia. So it's the same in Indonesia. There is I follow one course that, and during a pandemic, the course is using online, but I don't have a payback for that, because I used to be a face to face, but during pandemic that they closed the course and using online, then I don't have a payback for that.
Yes.
And I think that online course in Indonesia is a new thing that I think that it is a controversial too in Indonesia, and so because of that, I really interesting to know about how we can calculate or measure the quality change, and what can we do, and what indicator that we can use to measure the quality change.
Yeah, like I said, I'll try to talk to my colleagues who work mostly with CPI. But I think from what I've heard of the conversations, everyone is just kind of trying to figure out what to do and is kind of nervous about it now. And so I'm not sure if countries have actually put into place any quality adjustments now, but theoretically you would think, yes, it is a different quality product. I mentioned that in the United States, there were some people suing the school for not charging lower prices with remote. And one of the reasons they did that is because certain US universities used to charge one price for in-person education and a lower price for online education. Now everyone has to go online, but they're not charging everyone the lower price. So, you know, universities are struggling as well in the academic environment where students aren't on campus. So it's a very difficult issue. I know if I was back in the US working on price indexes, I would definitely have to consult with senior management before I would make any kind of change of saying, I know, you know, that the quality of online education is this different than in-person education. It's just one of those very sensitive issues.
Okay, maybe, is there any question from Mas Randy? Maybe one more question before we move on to the dissemination practice for SPPI.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. First of all, I want to ask about this pandemic situation. Just like you said before, many companies shut down, so we have to input our price. What I ask is for our dissemination, when we release the news release for the PPI, what kind of information that we have to inform with our user, especially for the user from outside the BPS, what kind of information that we have to add for our news release. That the first one. And for the second one, for the quality adjustment, just like about passenger land transport, for some company it's still open, but the government have regulation about the capacity of the bus. So the passenger have to pay the, let's say, increase 100. So they have to pay 2 seat for 2 seat, but they just consume the 1 seat because the other seat is empty seat. So how we, this quality adjustment, how we calculate for our index? Thank you.
That is fascinating. I did it. They actually are charging the customers twice as much. Huh? They have to pay for the seat that's empty, even though it's not their fault that the seat is empty. It's the government saying so. I'm surprised. We don't have that situation here. That's a really interesting case. I'll give my opinion, but I have to confess, you know, it's such an interesting, unusual case that I would consult with others as well. So maybe I'll share that with some of my colleagues and see if they agree with the answer I will give. I mean, I always say the producer price index is looking from the perspective of the producer. So we don't necessarily think of as much about, you know, what the consumer is getting. We think about what the producer is providing. And if we think about what the producer is providing to the customer here, they're providing a bus seat to go from an origin to a destination. And if the price for providing that same service has really increased, I think it should be shown as a price increase, personally. But, so I would not make a quality adjustment. That's my first feeling on it. Because I think that said they really are, they're producing the same output. Now, if you say, I could see an argument for either way, right? The argument for saying that it's a quality change would be that, well, look, they're providing twice as much space to the customer. And even though the customer might not want that, that's still something of value. So I see the argument both ways. Let me talk to some of my colleagues about that. And I think this is one of those classic examples where it's such an unusual situation that some of us will have one opinion and others will have another. And I think sometimes we get to the right answer by sharing our opinions together and discussing the pros and cons of different ways. That's a very interesting situation, like the education. So I'm going to send a question back. Tomorrow, I'll be in the office. I won't be in the office, but I'll try to reach out to some of my colleagues and I will ask them that question. Because it's a very interesting situation. Personally, I kind of want to think about it more. I see both sides, right? They are getting something different in that they have more space, but they can't use that additional space, right? Because then they'll be close to the other person again. I think that's such a unique situation that I've really never experienced something like it. So let me come back to that one tomorrow. Hopefully you'll be with us tomorrow so I can provide you an answer if I get one. And then back on the what you would disclose to the public on the press release with the COVID situation. So our continuity notes, which I'll provide as well. I realized I did not send those today, but they generally say it's good practice to disclose if your response rates have significantly deteriorated, if you could characterize that in some way. Maybe if you don't provide the exact response rates, you have some kind of language that that indicates that response has declined, and I think everyone would understand that. If you introduce any new methods, like, for example, applying a quality adjustment to education now, I think it's good practice to also state that so your data users know that that's happening. I will also try to find here by tomorrow, I'm going to look around and see the kinds of notices that some other statistical offices have been putting out with their price indexes. I know the major European countries and Canada and the US have been putting out notes, and maybe I'll try to share a couple of those to give some examples of the kinds of things they're sharing. But you know, again, it's such a unique situation. I think really it's the principle of trying to disclose as much as you can without violating any of your confidentiality procedures. This is such an unusual time for compiling price indexes that we want to just kind of make it clear to our users that certain things are not happening as they otherwise normally would. So I'll try to send a couple of examples. Let me just write those down before I forget. Example of release and bus. Okay, now I'm going to move on and talk about dissemination, if that's okay.
Yes, okay. We can move on to the dissemination practice for SPPI.
Great. Okay. So really here, I'm just going to kind of show some examples of what I think are good practices for dissemination. And, you know, I think BPS should really be applauded. Right now, you're definitely a leader in the world because you subscribe to the Special Data Dissemination Standard. So you're meeting, you know, very high standards of timeliness, coverage, and periodicity of your data, well ahead of where most countries in your region and in most regions of the world are. So, you know, a lot of the countries that we present to and work with are not quite at the Special Data Dissemination Standard level yet. So I think by already, you know, being at that level, that means that you've met a lot of the quality criteria in terms of having procedures in place that guarantee the integrity of the data, disclosing the methodology of how the data is compiled. I've looked through that information on your website, and you have that information. And even better for me, it's in English as well as Indonesian, which is great. So you're already meeting most of, well, you're meeting the best practices already. And any improvements, I think, that would go from where you are today would just be, you know, extra improvements, as opposed to meeting a minimal quality standard, which you already surpass, because the minimal quality standard is the General Data Dissemination Service, and the SDDS, or Special Data Dissemination Standard, is the higher level that you already do meet. So for PPI, again, ideally monthly is a goal, but I totally understand that's something that takes resources to do. So quarterly is great. If you're able to release quarterly, I think that's great. And, you know, over time, as you continue to develop and improve, maybe monthly would happen in the future, but quarterly is great. The ideal timeliness is to release the data no more than 30 days after the reference period. And I say here, the next best is as close as you can get. You know, if you meet within 30 days of the end of the reference period, that's the highest standard. Now, again, I see you guys already do have an advanced release calendar, which is great. And you're releasing data on pre-scheduled predictable dates, so you're following the best practice. Ideally, the data would be released to all non-government users at the same time. And you would produce a press release that highlights key data variables and provides impartial analysis, highlighting annual and monthly or quarterly changes, depending on how frequent the index is, and describes major contributors. It's also good practice that the detailed data should be available in an accessible form on the website. Downloadable Excel files are better than PDFs because we could manipulate the data, you know, basically use it for analysis purposes. And I was able to download the Excel data for all of your PPIs, so that was great. That was extremely useful, and it was easy for me to do. So, like I said, I think you're already meeting best standards in these respects. So what I wanted to do here is just kind of show some examples of, I picked Denmark. I don't even know why, but I always thought that they had a nice looking website, and I think they do some things that are best practices in terms of disseminating data. But like I said, talking to you guys are already following, you know, most of the best practices. Any advice I would have for improving might be, you know, maybe providing more visual presentations of the data. And I can show you some examples of that here. So here, you know, this is their general navigation. They, you know, you can see it's a very clean display where it's not a lot of information on their navigation screens. They don't flood the screen with lots of different data. They, I'm just taking a small screenshot of their homepage, but it's generally, you know, lets you navigate to where you want to go, with the idea that most users who will come to the website are interested in just a particular piece of data. So here now I've moved on, just showing you how they display their PPI. Again, you guys already have this as well, where you have a welcome page that kind of gives you some information about the PPIs, with the documentation of how it's compiled, with some key figures, and then some way to navigate to get the full set of data. Another nice thing they have here is they have a contact number and name, which is nice. If sometimes I know you don't want to give a name. You're a bigger country than Denmark, so you probably have a lot more data users than they do. So you probably want to just have a general number, so one poor person doesn't get flooded with phone calls. But you know, I think, again, it's good practice to have some way, give people some way to contact the office, and I know you already do provide that. But here's what I kind of thought was nice about the way Denmark presents it, and I know other countries do this as well. they give visual tools to show highlights of their data. So here's an example of a graphic that they have on their site that graphs different major components of their PPI for different periods. And they define it. And I think they also they have interactive tools that people can manipulate the visual presentation. So, you know, this is a nice tool if you have it. I know you guys, I saw you have training on Tableau. If you're able to use Tableau to create visualizations that you put on your website or in your press release, I think that's really fantastic. I think that helps in, you know, making the press release visually interesting, drawing people's attention. If you want, you know, media to be able to quickly see what is the data is showing, sometimes these visualizations are very nice. I know that we have to be careful with the kinds of visualizations we put out there. I know many statistical agencies have rules about, you know, we want to be very careful that what we're showing is significant differences. But generally, I know more and more countries are putting these kinds of visualizations in their releases, and that's a nice practice if you can. Another thing that I really like here is they release their indexes with the percentage changes for the 1 month change or the 1 quarter change. And, you know, some countries will also put their annual percentage changes right with the data. And I think that's a nice kind of way to present information as well, which kind of puts context around the indexes on the website. Again, here you could see all of these have the same index reference period. If you were to use a different approach, you'd have to show that some indexes would have different index reference periods. These are nice kinds of presentations to put in a press release where you have, this is actually showing the contribution of the change. So basically it's the weighted contribution of the different subcomponents to the aggregate changes. And they provide 1 and 12-month changes here. Again, it's just another nice analytical tool that you could put in the release. When I mentioned that some countries have different rules about limitations you could put on these visualizations, I think in the United States, they say you can't order the categories by magnitude because the differences may not be statistically significant. So they always list the categories in alphabetical order. Again, you know, I think either way is fine. It's just a matter of having rules and sticking to whatever rules are in place. This is actually an example from the United Kingdom here, but I thought this was a very nice presentation. And another thing that's good practice to do is to put the relative importance somewhere accessible on the website. So I think in your case, that would be, you know, if you put out the 2010 weights, just some kind of easy display where people can see how much each of the detailed categories contribute to the aggregates. And I didn't have a chance to check to see if you have that on your website, but that's another nice piece of data that users sometimes want, and providing that, you know, is useful, helps them understand the aggregate changes. In terms of integrity of the PPI, I know you guys said you have a statistical law, right? You want to follow the laws and guidelines established. And I think we talked about how confidentiality is extremely important to companies. So anything you can do to demonstrate the protections you have in place to, first of all, secure pre-release data. So when you're calculating the indexes, but they're not yet public, you might want to put in place, maybe, and again, you may very well already have practices in place where you limit the people who can have access to those aggregates before they are released, just to safeguard against any unauthorized disclosure. Also, you any practices that you can have to protect respondent confidentiality. Like I said, we would have laws in place that said, individual business price reports would only be made available to people with a business need to know. And if they shared that data with anyone else, they would be immediately fired, and they would also be subject to criminal penalties. Again, and it's just something that you can put out to show that how the agency takes this very seriously. And by the way, over time, there have been cases where data was unknowingly disclosed. I don't think so much with individual business information, but where pre-release data was disclosed by accident. I can remember a couple of examples in the United States where the people who make the website were supposed to put the data out at 10 a.m. and by some glitch, they put the data out the day before at night, maybe. And so when you have some kind of mistake like that happens, you have to be very transparent. You have to make a report that explains what happens and why it happens and what you're doing to make sure it never happens again. Those are all parts of following integrity of the process. Also, as part of the integrity, you want to make the methodology information easily accessible. And when you make changes, when you add a new, expand the PPI to include new activities, you want to put out a notice that explains that and how you're doing it. If you, let's say, change the method and introduce a new imputation method, you'd want to disclose that, put a notice on the website about it. That's just good practice, so that any significant changes to the methodology of how you're formulating the index is disclosed to your data users, ideally in advance of when it's implemented. So if you're going to change the imputation method, you would try to provide the notice the month before you do it, or at least as much time before as possible. And again, I know you don't have a revision policy for PPIs. I really like a revision policy personally. I think it's good practice, because there are going to be times where some company comes and they tell you, they made a mistake with the prices they provide a month or two ago. So I think it's best practice to be able to revise those numbers for the most recent periods, but you're not unique in not having a revision policy. I think most countries don't. I know some of you work in national accounts. I always like to tease the national accounts because they go back and revise for years and years and years. I'm very jealous that they could do that. But if you do have a revision policy, or you consider it in the future, and again, it might be something you want to consider, then it just has to be clear and consistent. If you always revise the previous quarter, then you always just revise the previous quarter. You don't suddenly go back and revise 2 quarters ago. You follow whatever rules are in place. And also, if you have data that is subject to later revision, you want to indicate that on the initial release. Say, this number may be revised next quarter based on late or corrected price reports. Again, the important thing with all those kinds of corrections or changes to any data is that they are fully disclosed and everyone is aware. There may be some situations where you do have a mistake and you have to go back and fix it. It's not a happy time when you have one of those situations, but I've seen it happen. I've been involved in situations where for one of the detailed PPIs, we had to go back and change the historical data, and we would always put out a press release and explaining what it was, and we would disclose as much as we could about the error without jeopardizing any respondents' confidentiality. And we always try to, mistakes happen in statistical compilation, and the best practice that countries do is they disclose and they explain what actions they're taking to make sure that it hopefully does not happen again. So here's just an example of I think that now I'm back to the Denmark website, and you can see how they kind of walk through the different aspects of quality of the data, the accessibility and clarity, the accuracy and reliability. They disclose their sample size. They talk about their sampling procedures, that it sounds like they use a cutoff method of 70% of Danish production, so they disclose that. The more you're able to share about your methods, and again, I know you already do this, is beneficial. Okay, so I think I'm gonna stop sharing that now. Let me stop. And I could take any questions, and tomorrow we'll hit the topic of linking price series, which will be even more confusing than I've been today, but I'll try my best.
No, we already have our Director of Price Statistics, Mr. Nurul Hasanuddin. Maybe do you have any comment or something that to say? Selamat bergabung, Pak Hasan. Maybe there is some connection problem. So is there anything else to, or is there any question? Yes, Mas Fendi.
Okay,
Please.
thank you, Debbie. We know that the BLS publish the PPI is monthly. Do you have a timetable for the advanced release calendar for the BLS? Can you show us?
Muted. Are you interested in seeing their specific release calendar? Because I could, yes, they do publish. Yeah, I'll share that. It should be on their website, but I can get that. I think they make like a some kind of like large release calendar that includes all the releases of all the data products, I think, but I'll have to go back and research that and see what I can find. But absolutely, I can get that. I know about the practice when I last worked there, which was about 5 years ago. I think the PPI would always be released, I think, 3 days before the CPI, if I remember correctly. And it would be about in the middle of the month after the reference period. So the June 2020 PPI would be released in mid-July. But I will say one thing I would like to highlight about that, because that's a very aggressive and fast schedule. And the only way they can do that is that they have a revision policy. Okay, because I can assure you, as someone who used to, be responsible for those indexes, a lot of the price reports come in late, and a lot of people make corrections. So, or sometimes we have, people report a quality change with a product, and we're not able to get all the information to make an adjustment by the time of the release. So we might just let the price impute, and then we continue to work on getting the corrected information, and then we'll revise the data later. So I think those two things are connected, being able to release quickly, and then, but still having the ability to revise it based on late data.
How far that you can, BLS could revise the data? How far for?
So for PPIs, it was a 4-month revision policy. I believe they've been doing research that they might change it to just a 2-month revision policy, because they were doing studies to see how much change they actually had. Another reason why revision was very important in the US is I mentioned that for services, there is quite a bit of unit value pricing. And sometimes that data is not available till a little bit later. So, I think it's even good practice. There have been other countries where I said, you know, again, of course, it's an individual choice of every statistical agency, but I think even revising back just one period sometimes is helpful, because it is often the case that you get some late information that really does, you know, could make a significant difference in the compiled indexes. And again, as long as you're disclosing what is subject to revision and it's all very clearly labeled, I think it's okay. Now, I will also say that it's generally considered a quality measure to try to minimize revisions to the best of your ability. So that is one of the quality metrics that's tracked with the data. So we try to minimize the revisions, but like I said, I think even a revision of one period sometimes can be helpful.
Bapak Ibu silahkan ada pertanyaan lagi atau sharing pengalaman, mumpung masih ada waktu. So today we will discuss about the linking price too, or?
No, I would think, no. Too complicated to do in 5 minutes. But,
oh yeah, okay.
But I think we'll have plenty of time tomorrow, because what I'll do is I'll go through linking. Then I'll give a summary, a very brief summary, and we can have more question and answer. And then I'll present just some very basic recommendations. So I don't think, you know, I think we were able to be very productive with our conversation yesterday. So I think we were able to elaborate some of the key points that I'll put in it as the recommendation. So I don't think we'll need an extended period of discussion, but I'll just present some of those high-level recommendations, and maybe talk about, you know, just to let you know about all the ways that I could be available to assist as you move on to covering other activities. I just want to reiterate again, you guys have been such a great group to, I really appreciate your great questions and your careful attention. And so I hope that I'm always happy to do additional video calls or consultations to continue as you're making this great progress with your SPPI.
Okay. Maybe there is an announcement for tomorrow. There is a little revision for the schedule. Maybe we have a learning session at 7:30 until 10:15, just until 10:15, because we have to prepare for the closing. And between the learning session, we have 15 minutes post-test. How?
Yes.
It is okay, Andrew?
Yes, I will load the post-test. That I know how to do on the website, so I will do that. It'll be on there by the time we meet again tomorrow.
Okay. Is there any question else?
Tes, bisa Mbak Devi?
Oh ya, Bu Indri, silakan.
Saya kira, maaf. Yeah. Okay, Sir Andrew, I have one question. Maybe you can tell us, getting data at the company is more difficult than household respond.
Bu Indri, sorry, you can louder. You can speak louder.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Oke, tes. Bisa ya? Bisa Mbak Debbie?
Yes, it's good.
Okay. I would Okay. Sir Andrew, I have one question. It's about collecting data. Getting data at the company is more difficult than household respondent. Do you have a suggestion for that? Yes.
For
Hello.
household, Bu Indri?
Okay. Then.
Yeah, hello.
Hello. Halo?
Yeah,
Bisa nggak
yeah,
gitu?
yeah.
Oke.
Yeah, halo.
Oke. Bisa?
Bisa. Tadi pertanyaannya collecting data to household ya, Bu Indri?
Getting data at the company is more difficult, okay, than household responding. Halo? Kok nggak dengar?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Any suggestion, Mr. Andrew?
Yes. So your question is any advice on how to get for dealing with the difficult challenge of collecting data from businesses?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I think that the areas I would focus on is, first of all, trying to make sure your data collection aligns with the record keeping practices of the companies as closely as possible. So you're asking them for pieces of data that you know that they should have. And part of that is the in-depth study, right, that I know you guys have done. Part of that in-depth study, it's good to talk to companies or to associations that that have insight into the kinds of records that companies keep. Okay, the way you collect prices, you want to be based on as close as possible to how the businesses themselves analyze their prices. So I mentioned, when we look at some of if you're going to use a unit value method, learn about how the companies track their averages, so you can try to be as closely aligned to that as possible. There's ultimately no better way to convince a company to participate than making it as easy as possible for them. Okay, so rather than saying, just kind of saying, this is how I think we should collect it, find out what they have and try to work with that information to the best of your ability. I think another way is to try to inform them about why the data is important. That's why I talked about maybe getting a letter from a senior policymaker or the central bank or something, so that you could say, I want to try to collect data. It's going to be as easy as possible, and this is why it's very, very important. Okay, so you want to be clear with that messaging when you visit the businesses. Let me think if there's anything else. And then you could also, so why it's important, why it's easy, and then third, maybe how they themselves can use the final data. And so sometimes when we would visit companies, maybe they didn't care that much about the PPI, maybe that wasn't that useful to them, but we would share other data that maybe BPS produces that the companies are not aware of, but that they actually would find very useful. And we would bring along information, not necessarily about the PPI, but maybe about some of these other data that your agency produces. So I think that's another strategy that can be successful in trying to help convince the companies to participate. Ultimately, it's almost like having a sales job. We have to rely on trying to convince these companies. And I think the best motivators are, look, it's not that hard. We'll make it easy. It's important. And you might find some value from the data we produce. Those are the three best selling points, I think.
Cukup, Bu Indri? Yeah, maybe because for the BPS region, the most important thing is how to get the data from the company, because response rate is still our big homework and big challenges for us. So is
Yeah,
there
and-
anything
Yeah.
else?
Hello, especially this during the pandemic, they refuse for various reasons. So
Well, I could say during the pandemic,
yeah, during
all
the pandemic they
statistical
refuse.
offices,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah, during the pandemic they refuse for various reasons. We are closed, we are temporary closed, or they are with various reasons. So we difficult for collecting the data.
Yes, I think every country around the world has been reporting similar experiences. If a company is temporarily closed, there's really nothing we can do about that. That's why we stress the importance of imputation. Another thing, though, that sometimes is happening is if you're relying on personal visits, you know, maybe the people are not at the company, they're working from home. So you want to try to see if there's other ways that you could look into whether you could do a Zoom meeting like this or something, or a phone call, something where you could reach them at home where they might be working. And again, remember I said that sometimes it's the finance officials who are good people to provide pricing information. Those are also the people that are probably more likely to work from home during the pandemic. I'll just add one more thing also. If there's any, if you could do anything where respondents can either email the price. Now I know that has to be cleared with like computer security, right? You need to have rules and you have to make sure that you're comfortable with the computer security. But if your rules allow for that, then I would do that. The thing I heard from a lot of businesses is they said, I don't want to do a complicated fill out a form. If I could just email it, or if I could just send you a spreadsheet. I forgot to mention that. You know, for some of the very large companies, like the big telecom companies or the big transportation companies, they wouldn't want to get on our online application to fill out the information. We would say, okay, if you just want to send us the spreadsheet with the data we agree upon, we would take data that way. And I really want to stress that was very common in my experience. That made it much easier for them because they didn't have to remember a password to log into a website, or they could just do it in a way that was easy for them.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and I could just answer this question here.
Yeah, one more question. Okay.
No problem. But,
hello, Andrew.
Okay.
Yep. Maybe.
Sebentar, pertanyaan dari chat dulu. There is question from Bu Esther from West Java.
Yes. So no, in the US, not all the sample was big companies. It would be a fully probability proportionate to size sample. So all companies that were eligible for selection, as long as they had at least one employee, they were eligible to be selected. I will say generally, you know, the smaller companies were sometimes very challenging to collect data from. We found that as well, you know, because with the larger companies, we could try to make some kind of arrangement that worked convenient for them. But for the smaller companies, often it just was not possible. And frankly, we would accept that the response rate wasn't always so great for the small companies. There was all we could do is as much as we could try. There's no perfect solution to get all these small companies to participate.
Okay, maybe one more question from Mukhtar. It is the farthest BPS in Indonesia from Papua.
Ah.
Yes,
Hello.
please. Uta.
Andrew, good evening. Okay, you said that we can use another data from BPS when companies refuse to give the data. So we can use CPI price data as a proxy for PPIs.
I would not say to use it if they, well, yes, I did say that the other day. I think it depends on the activity, okay? There are certain activities where the CPI would closely match the PPI and others where it would not. I think, for example, for the passenger transportation services, I would think as much as possible as you can share data with CPI, that would probably be helpful, right? Because a lot of the data should be the same. The only adjustment you'd probably need to make is if the taxes change. So when I worked on PPIs, there were some areas where we would share data with the CPI. But it was certainly not most areas, not most activities. It was only activities where we thought they would be fairly close. I think restaurants, food service is an area where it would probably make sense to share data. Any activities where the majority of the services are purchased by resident households.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Maybe it is enough for this morning, or maybe for you this evening, late evening. Thank you about this course about the index calculation. We hope that it will make us more clearly about how to calculate the index, or more confusing maybe about how to, and about the dissemination practice for SPPI and also the quality adjustment. Maybe we will continue our course tomorrow about the brief summary. Brief summary, and also don't forget about the post test tomorrow.
Yes. So you said we're going to start at 7:30 tomorrow?
Yes, tomorrow we will start at 7:30.
Okay, very good.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all the participants for today.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Yang siang nggak ada Mbak Dep?
Untuk nanti siang jam seperti biasa ya, jam 12.50 ya Bapak Ibu, kita ada diskusi tentang penghitungan indeks dan mungkin ada exercise ya, Mas Fendi? Atau Cepi?
Nanti Pak Ilham yang ngasih exercise pengolahan.
Kok pengolahan?
Enggak. Nanti kita mungkin lebih bisa pakai contohnya Andrew atau nanti apa sih penghitungan indeks langsung yang punya kita kali ya Mas Fen. Bisa nggak? Oke, ya udah Bapak Ibu silahkan istirahat dulu. Nanti kita gabung lagi di jam 12.50. Terima kasih buat perhatiannya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bu S. Esther.
Ya.
Ada Mas Roni nggak? Mas Roni gabung nggak?
Enggak, dia kan cuti.
Oh, kan habis nikah tuh. Dikasih selama di sini kan.
Ya, 1 bulan cutinya.
Wis.
Heeh.
Selamat ulang tahun ya, Bu ya.
Ya sebentar, Mbak. Dasar.
Yang ulang tahun nih.
Enggak lah.
Ada yang ulang tahun. Ada yang ulang tahun tuh. Budia tuh ulang tahun tuh.
Katanya mau nyanyi, ini Bu Indri buat yang ulang tahun.
Siapa? Aku. Mas Epi
Iya,
aja yang
lah.
nyanyi.
Bu Indri duet sama Pak Budi.
Cocok. Pak Budi duluan.
Terus yang video buat Andrew jadi nggak Bu Indri sama Pak Budi?
Insya Allah nih lagi dibikin.
Oh ya.
Wah, luar biasa Bu Indri nih.
Ini yang bikin ada temen nih yang bikin, dia lagi on progress itu, lagi pusing.
Luar biasa.
Terima kasih buat tim Jawa Tengah yang udah bantu bikin.
Oh, sama-sama.
Iya, terima kasih ya teman-teman di Jawa Tengah. Luar biasa sekali kontribusinya.
Mudah-mudahan berkenan ya.
Ada pantun nih.
Iya, pantunnya belum tadi, Mas Epi.
Ya. Makan siang.
Mas Epi nggak kelihatan kok.
Makan siang jangan berkeringat. Agar tetap
Cakep. Cakep.
Mana Pak Budi? Diulangi.
Ulang tadi.
Makan siang jangan berkeringat. Biar
Cakep.
tetap semangat.
Cakep.
Oh, doang Pak. Ya ampun.
Pantun tuh
Kirain
4
panjang.
baris, masih kurang 2 lagi.
Sekarang 2 dulu, nanti 4.
Oh ya udah.
Keren.
Ya sudah, dimaklumi saja. Oke, Bapak Ibu saya akhiri ya. Zoom-nya. Terima kasih.
Ya, Bu Esther, salam buat Pak Dudung.
Oh iya akan disampaikan.
Nggak
Oke.
kenal juga sih, Pak Dudung nggak kenal saya maksudnya.
Kok bisa kenal Pak Dudung, gimana ceritanya?
Akhir tahun kemarin kita dari Papua studi banding tuh Bu, 7 orang ke Jawa Barat, tahu nggak?
Oh iya.
Studi
Iya.
banding.
Hebat loh Papua Barat studi banding mulu.
Allah, kebanyakan uang ke Papua Barat.
Iya, ke Jawa Tengah juga kan?
Ke Jawa Tengah juga Bu, betul. Sulawesi.
Susah ngabisinnya ya.
Iya, kemarin kalau saya ke Bandung, satu kabupaten 15 orang ke Bandung sama kemana gitu, ngabisin uang.
Jujur banget ya, ngabisin duit.
Iya. KPK-nya siapa dulu ya Bang Leo ya?
Iyalah.
Oke deh, biar yang lainnya bisa istirahat, kita live ya.
Oke, terima
makasih.
kasih semuanya.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.